All right, so I bought this computer in early 2015, so it has been a long time. At this point now, I've built myself a gaming PC. This thing doesn't get much use, and part of why it doesn't get much use is that it really cannot hold its own. So what I wanted to do was try a little bit of a refresh on it and see how well we can get it performing. So we're gonna take a look at how we can improve the cooling a little bit, what we can do around storage, and then also take my older graphics card and toss it in and see if this tired 7-year-old computer still has a bit of life left in it. So this is the HP Envy Phoenix 810, I think is what they called it. Overall, it's a pretty solid PC. It's got some headphone jacks and USBs up top. It's got this little door that lowers down to reveal a card reader as well as some more USBs. It's actually a pretty nice case, pretty nice computer overall. On the inside, we see a massive jumbled mess of wires. So this is truly showing you the age of the computer. This is our power supply up here with this just mess of colored wires, not nice and neatly bunched together like you'll get out of most power supplies today. And overall, it looks old. We got the nice classic green motherboard in the back, and maybe the world's smallest graphics card. It's really funny now that you see these giant big Chungus cards they have nowadays, and we've got this little tiny guy, little tiny fan on it. So what do we have in here? So the center of the whole thing is actually still kind of decent. So it is an Intel i7 4790K. In terms of cooling for the CPU, it did come stock with this small single fan radiator water cooling AIO system. It's got a small 92 millimeter fan, and we're gonna kind of, I think, be able to make it a little bit janky, but I think we're gonna be able to throw a larger fan on here without it being too ridiculous. That might help with some of the whine of these smaller fans. And then also just overall with airflow. If you look around, you'll notice that there's no other fans in here. This is strictly a pull in from the back, so taking fresh air from the back. And then there's holes on this panel that we removed as well as on the back where air will flow out. So it's not the most effective cooling, and it's certainly not one that you would see very much from a system today, at least not a custom built one. But all in all, when you've got the water cooling, you're pulling the air over that, and then otherwise you're pushing it out from other parts of the PC, it probably does well enough. I never really had any issues with temperatures, but granted, we didn't have a high-performing GPU in here. Other components, we do have, this is one of the things that I upgraded and really never got full use of. This is a 3 terabyte hard drive. It's a basic 7200 speed classic hard drive, and that thing today is so slow. When I was looking up details about the hard drive and all the other components in prep for this video, I looked at this particular model, and it is apparently notorious for failing to the point where there was a class action lawsuit about it. So I'm looking forward to taking that out as one of these steps and putting in an SSD to really speed this guy up. In addition to that, we have our graphics card, which is an NVIDIA GTX 745. And so this is where we really start to fall off in terms of modern day performance. This card cannot keep up with modern day games and with a lot of the stuff that I wanted to do. And that's the first thing The first thing that really drove me to go out and build my own PC is the fact that my GPU just couldn't hang. The last one here is the RAM, and this one was kind of interesting actually. I priced out what they were charging for their RAM upgrades when I was buying this direct from HP, and it was absolutely insane. I don't remember the exact details, but I did find an old email to a friend, hi Matt, So about the details of what computer I was buying. These were about $300 for a 32 gigabyte kit of RAM. That was so much of a savings compared to what HP wanted to charge that I just said, screw it, give me the base RAM. And I went out and bought this kit of Corsair Vengeance Pro, 32 gigabytes. They're DDR3, 1600. And honestly, those have been amazing. I never had any sort of problems with RAM, and that was the one thing that I went over and above with to really try and make sure that I didn't have any problems there. So the only other thing is the power supply, which you don't get any options when you're building OEM. This is a 420 watt power supply. So we're gonna be butting up against that a little bit, putting in a higher powered GPU, but I think we should be okay. And if not, then we can replace that next. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get going. So the first thing that I wanna do is I'm going to take off this cooler, reapply some thermal paste since it is 7 years old. We're then going to replace the hard drive with an SSD and then finally put in the graphics card. So without further ado, the first things first is that this CPU has a unique fastener. So it does require a Torx, it's a T10. So I have this little kit here. I will link this down in the description if I can find it, but it's got Torx in it. It's got all sorts of little small odds and ends sorts of things. And anytime I've run into a strange requirement like this has been great for me. So a kit like this is beautiful. I know the most famous ones out there are the iFixit kits, things like that. This will be significantly cheaper, and in my case, it had exactly what I needed. And so let's go ahead and take this off. I'm also gonna have a regular screwdriver here to take off the radiator portion, just so I can pull this entire thing out. Rest of this cooler out. All right, moment of truth. Let's see what we're dealing with. All right, not too bad. All right, so a little bit of thermal paste will get cleaned off of there, and then a little bit on the CPU itself. So should be a relatively easy job. So some people will tell you to use a microfiber cloth instead of a paper towel. Obviously that is totally fine. The biggest thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to scratch up the surface, and you also do not want to leave any remnants on it. So what we're taking off here, thermal paste is really what allows your cooler and your chip to truly touch each other directly. And so at a molecular level, these two pieces of metal, even though you think metal will touch metal and conduct heat, at a microscopic level, they're not gonna line up exactly right. And so you're gonna wind up with small little gaps and things based on the natural ridges and valleys of the two materials. And so what the paste does is it is a thermal conductive paste, so that when the CPU heats up, it's going to use that to fill in all of those cracks and connect the two and allow more heat to dissipate from the CPU to the cooler. And so what we're doing now is, this has been on here for 7 years, so it gets dried out, it ages. It's just not gonna be quite as effective. If this is something that intimidates you, it's really not. I'm not expecting to see a life-changing improvement in performance from this. But I think we could have some noticeable gains just from refreshing this and make sure that the chip is staying cool and that we're not having any real problems. All right, so you can see that it is almost fully clean. So now we're gonna use a Q-tip to just get in there and get the final details. So we're using just a basic rubbing alcohol. You can see some of it coming off there on the Q-tip itself. You can also see some of those letters on the chip starting to appear. And so we don't have to get this completely perfect, but we just want to get it good enough. On the block here, the reason why we're using rubbing alcohol is because it'll evaporate quickly, so we're not going to be left with any sort of residue. All All right, so as you can see, we're looking pretty darn clean there on the block, and we're looking pretty good on the chip as well. And so we are good to reapply our thermal paste, and then we can put that back on there. All right, and so as I mentioned, I am going to use a different fan, or at least attempt to use a different fan. And so I'm gonna go ahead and take the screws out of this included one. So the fan I'm gonna be adding in is one of the case fans that came with my Corsair 4000D case. So I replaced it with some RGB fans. And so I have this one lying around, and I think it will both sound better and then also move some more air compared to this very cheap one from the original OEM build. Yeah, so here is that original fan. It does have red LEDs, so it also just kind of looks silly. And it is a very cheap fan. So we're gonna try and get rid of that. So I will grab my thermal paste. So when you're applying thermal paste, you just wanna not offend the internet by applying the perfect amount. Haha. So I'm gonna put about a pea-sized amount and not give a close-up so that nobody hates on me in the comments. Yeah, for some reason people are very picky about thermal paste. Ultimately, you want to apply a reasonable amount to the center of the chip, and then when you're putting your cooler back on, you want to make sure that you kind of do it in a pattern across so that it gradually and evenly distributes the weight as it's going down, and that will naturally spread the paste around the entire chip. So you don't need to spread it all around or do anything crazy like that, and you don't need to use a ton. And ultimately, based on some really good testing by Gamers Nexus, it really doesn't make all that much difference how much you use. So give people a break, use how much you want to use. Let's go ahead and get this reinstalled. And now you want to do kind of a diagonal pattern across. So we were doing top right, so now we'll do bottom left. Give that a couple turns. We'll come across here. And come up here, and we're just gonna keep going with that pattern, gradually bringing it down onto our chip. Just make sure that they're all on there snug so that your cooler is gonna be tight to the CPU, but you don't wanna go crazy because you don't wanna spread that out, spread out your thermal paste too much and have it go everywhere. But there we go, so we got that back installed. We can now put the radiator back here where it belongs. All right, so radiator is back installed. We can plug this back into the pump header. And now let's bring in our fan. So like I mentioned, this is a Corsair fan that comes with the 4000D cases. It's this nice, all kind of blacked out. And comparatively, so this was a 92 millimeter compared to a 120 millimeter. And so this one should be capable, particularly because it's newer and higher end than that one, it should be able to move a substantial amount of air by comparison. So even though this is going to be a bit janky, I'm hoping we can get this to work. And really what we're up against, quite literally, is that we have our CPU power right here. And we wind up pushed up against that with this fan. But I think there is just enough clearance where we're not going to be bending our CPU power, but we can still get this connected in. I think we'll be able to get just one screw in there, and because of its size, it actually will hold it in pretty snug. That was actually a lot easier than I expected it to be. And so we have a very snug fan, even with just the one screw, based on the fact that there's other things around just supporting it and preventing it from rotating. And we have just enough clearance, so we're not going to be hitting the fan blades on it, and we're not unnecessarily bending our CPU power. So it's literally, you know, by a hair, we've got enough room to be able to get these larger fans in there. So that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and put this into our CPU fan header. One thing to notice here is that this is a 3-pin fan, and our CPU header on this motherboard happens to be 4 pins. And so there's a little guide on here that will allow you to make sure that you line it up with the correct 3 pins. So that 4th pin is really just to control variable speeds. And so we should not have an issue running this 3-pin fan in the 4-pin header. There we go. This particular motherboard has that header directly up against the RAM. So I did have to pull a couple of these sticks out in order to make that work, but I'll just get these easily popped back in. So there we go. So that's step 1. So step 1 is cooling. So like I said, this CPU is still a pretty capable chip, and it's got some water cooling. It's old water cooling, but it should still be able to keep it going. And now if we've got a little bit of extra airflow and some fresh thermal paste, we should be able to make sure we're getting the most out of this chip and make sure that we're not sacrificing anything or leaving anything on the table when we start bringing in these other components that are gonna, really let it go. So the next thing here is gonna be storage. And so this is a Crucial MX500. This is a 1 terabyte SSD. It's a 2.5 inch SSD, so there's a couple different form factors. You can get the M.2s, which look basically like a stick of gum. If this motherboard had a slot like that, I definitely would have bought one, but this is what we got. This motherboard doesn't have anywhere designated. A lot of places, a lot of motherboards will have the ability to attach these on the back or somewhere in a nice discrete place. In our case, we're probably just gonna have to let this hang out in where our regular 3.5 inch hard drive bays are. Not ideal. We could zip tie it down if we want, but it's not the end of the world. This thing can get banged around a little bit, and this is not gonna be a very mobile computer. So what do we need to do to install this? So the first thing you need to make sure you have is an ability to give it data and ability to give it power. And so this case in particular was built to have numerous hard drives. So we've already got several connections here to be able to hook this up. There's plenty of open SATA headers, but we do not have any free SATA cables. So you've got an option. You can either purchase a SATA cable and use that, or you can kind of steal it from somewhere else. So we've got an old disk drive up in the top here, and I cannot remember the last time that I used that disk drive, and I cannot foresee many reasons in the future where I would possibly need to access one. So I've already unplugged the cable from that disk drive, and that's gonna allow me to plug into our SSD. So it only goes in one way, kind of hard to mess up. And now we can use one of these. Boom. So not in an ideal position right here, but basically what you need to do is get it so that both your existing hard drive and your SSD are connected. And then that way what you can do is go onto your computer and copy the relevant data over to this SSD. Otherwise, you can set up this SSD for a fresh install of Windows. It's really up to you how you want to do it. What I did is I used a piece of software and I was able to just mirror everything off of the hard drive onto the SSD. And so I've got this already set up so that I can boot directly off of this. And honestly, at this point, I don't need the hard drive anymore. So I'm actually gonna just unplug this altogether from both ports. Eventually I can reattach my power to the existing disk drive if I wanna now use that. But then the SSD, still being janky, we can just shove in the top there. It's not gonna bounce around too much because those cables are really supporting it. But now we've got a pretty darn fast SSD that'll be able to give us much better boot speeds, much better ability to move files, download things, etc. And so that's enhancement number 2. So the last thing here to do is to install our graphics card. And if you watched my previous video where I finally upgraded my personal new gaming PC, what I was replacing was this, and this is an Asus NVIDIA 1060, and it's a pretty decent card, and it really still holds its own, but since I finally got my hands on a more modern card, the 3060 Ti, that went into my main gaming PC, and now this is gonna come in here. And so this combination of improving the cooling, improving the storage speeds, and massively improving the graphics, I think is gonna give us a pretty capable machine here. So in order to install this, we first need to remove our existing card. And this case has an interesting feature. So there is this cover on the back, which restricts your ability to do anything with these PCI slots. And so you first have to take this cover off, and then that allows you to actually get at your GPU. And so it's an interesting way of doing it. Modern cases now will have each of the slots with screws. In this case, it's just one thing holding whatever's there with a plate. The other thing that's unique here and is pretty typical of some lower end cases is that rather than having removable pieces, you actually, oddly enough, just break the metal off when you need to open up another expansion slot. And so this piece used to be on here, and I kind of had to bend and mangle it before I eventually broke where it was connected. And what that means is that you can open up space for additional cards, but what that also means is that you can't ever go back. Once you've got your slots open, they're open. And so I needed to open up one additional slot for this 2-slot graphics card compared to my existing one. And then now we just need to take this card out. So this one doesn't have a clip like a lot of modern motherboards, but instead it has a little like pull tab. And so you kind of pull it down, and then simultaneously you need to pull the card out. And it's a little bit tougher to do, but allows you to take out the card. And so there it is. There's my GTX 745. Back then, I wasn't playing crazy graphically intensive games, and this is very dusty. When I first bought this, I was playing games like City Skylines and Planet Coaster and stuff like that, and those were, you know, fully handled by this guy. Today, with higher settings and bigger monitors and all that, it starts to struggle. And then particularly if you want to start playing more modern games than those, then you're really gonna have challenges. But now we've got our 1060 GPU, and so it's gonna be installing it in the same way. So we don't have that clip there. We just have this little plastic piece that you bend back in order to get it open. We've already removed our slot cover, and during a test fit, I noticed that this is very tight because of the way that these power supply cables are everywhere in the case. But we should be able to sneak around them just barely. So we get ourselves lined up with the slot. I'm kind of using the back as my guide. I think there's still some cables back there blocking my way. There we go. Jeez, so it is a tough one because you cannot see anything back there. Eventually you'll feel it slide in, but you don't have that same satisfaction of a modern one where you've got the little clip. So similar, you know, when we were pushing in the RAM earlier and we feel that substantial click, you know you've got it in the slot. In this case, you're just kind of pushing it in and then all of a sudden it slides in. And so it's not as ideal, but you can see it does fit just barely. So we've got it in there. We can go ahead and reattach this. Now the only other thing here to do is to find in this maze of cables the right connector in order to give our GPU the power that it needs. And so the inside here we do have a 6-pin connector, and so we're gonna kind of pull that out from the rest of the crowd. I could take this zip tie off and make this a little bit neater, but it just fits. And so there's really no reason to break this all up and have it be everywhere. But what I will do is make sure that I don't have any cables that are gonna be on top of my fan blades, because that's gonna be sounding terrible. But there we go, that's item number 3. So we have now our GPU installed, it's getting power, it's in its slot, so we should have everything we need here to get this up and running and have what I think in just a short time could be a greatly enhanced gaming machine. And so we've got our thermal paste applied, we've got a bigger, better fan here, switching from hard drive to SSD, and then we've got a massive upgrade in our GPU capabilities. And so I'm gonna go ahead and get the side panel back on here, plug it in and see what happens. All right, so we're running the Heaven benchmark. The reason why I didn't use 3D Mark like I did in my previous video is that the GTX 745 GPU that had been in this computer originally couldn't actually run that benchmark. It wasn't sophisticated enough, it wasn't modern enough. So this is one that was available to run on both GPUs, and so trying to see what sorts of a percentage gain we get with this jump in from one GPU to another. And already it's looking like FPS sitting around 80 in this run right now, whereas we were in the teens with the previous runs. All right, so there we go. FPS 87.8, that's compared to 16.8, so that's like a 7 times improvement. Score went from a 423 to over 2,000. And then the really impressive thing here on high quality settings, the minimum FPS here was 32.9. And that means that even in the worst case, the worst points in these, it was still a very playable 30 frames per second. And it goes as high as 190. So compare that to a minimum of 6 and a max of 33.6 with the previous graphics card. I think this test clearly shows that this is an incredible improvement, which based on upgrading the GPU makes a lot of sense. All right, so the next test was Cinebench R23, and this one yielded some interesting results. I had done a baseline test before I made any of the changes to the system, and I knew that the impacts were gonna be somewhat marginal at best, given that all we did was change the thermal paste and change the fan. What I wasn't accounting for, though, is the fact that putting in a large new GPU was gonna completely change the way that the air flowed through the system. As I mentioned, there's only the one fan pulling in fresh air, but otherwise it has to go out of the case through the holes that are there on the sides. And by putting that new GPU that takes up the majority of the space of the case, I think what's happening is we are restricting that hot air from getting up and out of the sides of the case. So ultimately what happened is we wound up seeing a decline in our performance in Cinebench. And just to do a sanity check here, I decided, hey, let's put the old fan back in and rerun it and see what happened. And so ultimately we wound up with less than a 1% decline from old to new with the same old fan. Then when we switched out to the new fan, we had about just under a percentage increase back. So not quite to our original number, but close to it. And so this was definitive enough to me that, first of all, that new fan is better and the larger fan is gonna move more air, and that's a net positive for sure. And then that the airflow is being a little bit choked off by the large GPU, but when we're talking about the gains we're getting from the GPU and only about a percentage loss from the CPU performance, it's okay. So ultimately this was a really interesting test because it made me think more about the overall setup and how everything interacts. But I think that changing the thermal paste probably had a small positive impact despite the lack of airflow. And then that new fan clearly does have an improvement. And now the last thing to talk about is boot up speed. And so this was something that I knew changing from the hard drive to the SSD was gonna be a big improvement. I didn't quite realize how big of an improvement it was gonna be. So we've got the SSD in there. We're gonna go ahead and boot it up. And as a baseline, we took about 3 minutes to get booted and then logged in and into a program. And we are already up on our login screen. We enter our PIN. We're on our home page, or our desktop rather, and we've got Chrome open in a matter of seconds. That's down from 3 minutes. So it's mind-boggling what a difference that makes. And so ultimately, I really enjoyed this. This is a computer that took 3 minutes to boot, couldn't really play many games, and had okay performance in terms of the CPU, the processor. Now we've got one that will boot up instantly. It can play most modern games without an issue, and we haven't really sacrificed anything when it comes to CPU performance. So I'd say right there, that's a huge win. If you had to go out and buy all of these components right now, I spent about $100, 90-ish, I believe, on the SSD. And that was for a 1 terabyte version, which if you're looking to save some money, you could absolutely go smaller than that. The thermal paste will cost you a few bucks. The fan, also less than $10, you can get a decent fan. You might even be able to get one for free, like I did. And then the last thing is the GPU. And we all know that the GPU shortage is an absolute mess. You can get one of the specific one that I'm using for around 300 bucks on eBay. I don't know if I would recommend that when you could try your luck at getting something in a lottery like the Newegg Shuffle or something like that instead. But if you're looking for exactly this replication, you could do it all for about $400 if you've got the rest of it lying around ready to go. So for me, it only cost as much as the SSD, everything else I had. And so I'm really happy with how this is performing now. I think it's going to become a secondary computer. Might find some interesting things to do with it. Let me know down in the comments what you think I should do with it. I've been thinking about, should I get a different case, maybe a different motherboard? Should I rework this into a different form factor? I'm curious if you have any ideas or any thoughts. Let me know down in the comments. And other than that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy what you see, remember that the likes are always free and the subs don't cost anything either. This has been another really fun, really interesting computer related video. I hope you'll be around for the next one. I'll see you there.